Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am talking to the incomparable Kurt Andersen. Kurt is someone that I've admired from afar and whose work I've enjoyed for many, many years. You might know him as the co-founder of Spy Magazine with Jarrett and Kurt, or as the host of the truly delightful public radio show Studio 360, or as the author of novels like True Believers and Turn of the Century, or his new nonfiction book Fantasyland. What you might not know, though, is that in the middle of publishing the magazine that famously called Donald Trump a short-fingered vulgarian in 1988, and publishing novels and hosting a radio show, he was also the design and architecture critic for Time magazine for almost 8 years. And that's where this conversation started. I was very curious how someone who had been writing about crime and politics suddenly found himself writing about design for a major magazine. And what's been interesting to me about Kurt's career since then is that even though he's not really writing about design explicitly anymore, it's still a theme that seems to run through much of his work. In 2017, he published Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, that looks at America's seemingly predisposition to believe in myth and magic and fantasy. He goes back 500 years and brings us all the way up to the present in the era of Trump and fake news, and really puts this current moment into a historical perspective. It was one of my favorite books that year, and I think has a lot to do with design as well. So in addition to Fantasyland, we talk about his interest in moving between mediums. We talk about how his relationship to design has changed over the years and how he thought about writing design for a general audience in the late 80s. This was one of the most fun I've had in a conversation in a long time. I've been a fan of Kurt's for years, and his varied career is the kind that I aspire to. So it was a real honor to have him on the podcast. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that has additional content and episode previews. I think of this as kind of the director's commentary for the podcast. These memberships really help keep the podcast going, and I just appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this fun conversation with Kurt Andersen. So you were at Time, you worked at Time, and you were kind of writing about politics and criminal justice and things like that. And then what seems like, as someone who came to your work later, all of a sudden you became the design and architecture critic. And basically my question is, how did that happen and why did that happen?
That's a good question. And that's a good beginning for this conversation. I had been interested in design as a college undergraduate, took art history courses, took design history courses, but did not major in it. And to the degree any career path that I didn't take was one that I thought I might have taken. It was architecture. Anyway, so I get out and I get jobs writing, and I'm a writer, and I'm writing at Time magazine, and I'm in my mid-20s and writing about politics, as you say, and getting to do lots of writing. But I had gone there in the first place saying, oh, I'm 25, make me your movie critic, or make me your culture writer, or make me your something. Because there was no such thing as a design writer at the time. Right. So then, however, around, they said, no, we'll hire you to do this. And I said, great. And I did that, writing about politics and crime and cultural, socio-cultural subjects for a while. And then they hired... They announced they were going to hire a design and architecture critic and create that as a new section. And I said, how about me? And they said, no, we've got a guy. And we've already found a guy. And he's actually, unlike you, credentialed and is an architecture critic at the Washington Post. And nice try, we love you, but no. That didn't work out. And he did that for a year and left. And they said, okay, fine, Kurt, you can do it. So that's how that began, and I went from being this writer in the Nation section, National Affairs section, to being the design critic. And it happened like that. And again, it's a measure of how cushy in certain ways the media magazine world was in New York at that time, that they gave me some months off, and I don't remember how many, but months off to just steep in and read. And like I would go to the Cooper Union Library and read and just to sort of get up to speed, which was extraordinary. And so that's how I started doing that.
I mean, so you started answering my next question, because I was kind of curious about that, what that transition was like. And so you'd mentioned you'd studied some art and design history classes. You maybe had an interest in being an architect. What was that like when suddenly you had to write about? Did you have a sense of what a design critic should be writing about, or how you should approach these things?
No, because there may have been design critics at the time, but all I knew about were architecture critics.
Right.
You know, Ada Louise Huxtable, the great design critic of that era, Paul Goldberger was writing, and then I started reading, kind of academic writing about architecture and some design. But there was the idea of a kind of mass audience design critic. I don't know who that would have been. I mean, the Eameses wrote things, but they weren't design critics, right? And so I didn't. So no, I had no model. I felt at that point like, I knew how to write and I knew how to look, and so I figured, give it a try. Now, did I feel like a fraud? Yes, absolutely. I still occasionally feel like a fraud, but certainly then I did it and was very, careful. Even I'm careful in general, but I was very careful that my cover as a non-credentialed idiot wouldn't be blown, and it wasn't, and kept doing it, and people took me seriously, and so then people took me seriously, and it became a self-fulfilling thing. Suddenly I was a design critic. Can you talk a little bit about, what your subject matters were at that time? And I think sometimes it's hard in, 2018, where design is kind of this buzzword that people want to talk about. It wasn't so much then. So what were you kind of writing about? And then how were you writing about that for people that probably had no idea what design was? Right. Well, in terms of the mass audience, it was a kind of golden age at Time magazine, as it happens, that I just lucked into. And part of that golden age in my particular way was that Robert Hughes was the art critic. Yeah. Serious, big deal, influential art critic for Time magazine. That the editors at the time, one of them once told me, not many people read Bob Hughes, and it's a tiny fraction of our audience. But even those who don't, the fact that he's in the magazine makes them feel intelligent. Right. So I thought, oh, good. So you're saying I can write, not that it's going to be so highfalutin and abstruse that the readers won't understand, but nor was Bob Hughes. Right. And so that was a good model, really. It's oh, okay, he's super smart and knowledgeable and a vivid writer and all the things that he was. That can be my model. So that was, I didn't feel as though I had to talk down, or anything. Yeah. So there was that. But what did I write about? I mean, I would say, I haven't done a count, but I would say it was architecture and design. So some large fraction of the time, maybe half, I wrote about architects and buildings, and this guy Frank Gehry out in California, doing these interesting houses and apartments. Right. I remember one of my earliest pieces, maybe my first, maybe not, but early, was this idea I had about how black things were suddenly popular in consumer goods, in cars, in this mass market way. And I thought, that's weird, black having been the color of, in Huisman or in the Goths and anarchists. And what? Why is everybody buying black? And what's that about? So trying to sort of figure that out was one of my early pieces. And I was very happy with it, because it was this kind of curious, not an obvious trend piece, but it was a trend piece and a zeitgeist piece, and about the visual material culture. And my editor said sure, and they ran it, and I was kind of off and running. Do you find it's interesting that you talk about that black piece, and
I'll admit I was not able to get a lot of your Time Magazine pieces. A lot of them aren't online, or else I would have.
They're online. You just have to subscribe.
Right, and I'm not a Time subscriber, so I couldn't read many of them.
They're really, really good.
I'm sure they are. I'm
joking.
As I read a lot of your pieces in a short amount of time, I was struck by how often you kind of take a aerial view of something. And you kind of zoom out a little bit and look at this larger thing that's happening instead of talking about a specific event or object or building even. Whether that's Fantasyland or whether it's I think it was in Vanity Fair about kind of like how culture and style has stopped evolving.
Right.
Is that something that you picked up from kind of writing about other things, or how did that... How did you start to come to see that as a way to write about these things?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I did. Probably most of the pieces I wrote as the critic at Time were about specific buildings or at least a specific designer's or architect's work. But yes, one of my habits, knacks, interests has always been connecting various dots into a larger understanding of a piece of the universe or why this is happening now. So yeah, that's always been something I've when I have an actual idea that I like to do, like with Fantasyland or that essay in Vanity Fair in 2012. That's just, I don't know, pattern recognition.
Right,
I mean, really, I mean, connecting some dots that I hadn't seen connected in the way that was emerging in my mind, and doing that. It's just, what can I say? It's a thing. It's one of the things that I've enjoyed doing and can occasionally do. Now, the problem with that is and why, for instance, I never wanted to be like a weekly columnist or something, is you can't, or I can't, force that out on demand in a way that I'm satisfied with very often. They come and like, oh, that's a real idea worth saying, rather than what am I going to drum up as an idea, a big idea this week? I never wanted to do that. So it was just just as a satirical look at things was one of my habits of mind, or there's probably a half a dozen of them, and that kind of thing that you're talking about is one of the ways my mind, my writerly mind works.
And I don't want to spend this whole conversation talking about your 8-year stint as a design critic in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
But I am curious about how your relationship with that word design, or even writing about design, has evolved since then to now, when you might not necessarily call yourself a design critic, but I think design and architecture still filters very heavily into the way you look at the world and the subjects that you're interested in. How has that changed for you?
It does. I mean, back then it was just, when I was doing it in the 80s and early 90s, it was just getting groovy, and it was a little bit like it was just the kind of apartment life, early Gap, and that actually kind of put me off, even though it made me feel like, oh, this one of these things I do, one of these hats I wear, can be a gig, because it was cool suddenly. Along with everyone else in my own intellectual evolution, I've come to understand that everything almost literally everything can be regarded as a design problem, and the buzzword of design thinking and all that, all of which is true. And it, as you say, did keep appearing in other work I did. In my first novel, especially, in all my novels actually, there are things that after the fact I point to and go, oh, there's this description of San Francisco being built in 1848 or all. But in my first novel, I had just a whole fantastical, non-existent buildings in Las Vegas that I imagined and put in there. So the ability to think about design and spaces as a critic, I think, gave me the kind of knack and taste for putting it into other things. So So, and then the other thing I did, or the thing I did after my stint, and somewhat overlapping for a few years with my stint as a design critic, was start Spy magazine, which of course we had to design.
Right.
We had sort of peculiar design ambitions and brilliant collaborators to do that with, and so. That in a practical practitioner-y way made me think about design and graphic design and in a new and intense and I'm part of this team doing this way, and so it was a it wasn't an intentional evolution of my design life, but it was an evolutionary step in my design life.
Do you have any thoughts less about maybe your own kind of thinking about design, but as somebody who's kind of been in that world or related to that world for now, 30 years, how that term design critic or architecture critic, or even just design in general, how that's evolved, and kind of, do you have thoughts on kind of where we are kind of in this moment of design criticism or design writing?
I don't. I don't have a big thought about it because because I don't do that much of it anymore, but also I think it is it can mean so many different things. Design criticism, design writing, architecture criticism means people know what that means. Yet they thought they did. Let's look at the people who've written architecture criticism for the New York Times. Basically, there are people who write about this new building and that new building and this new building and that new building until Michael Kielman comes along, which isn't to say people before him hadn't done some of what he does, but he redefined that job unilaterally to be about not so much about buildings by famous dudes. And to me that's a really interesting kind of lagging indicator of where design criticism has gone and can go and maybe should go, which is to say about bigger things than, oh, look at the iPad, or oh, look at this Helmut Jan building.
Or this company has a new logo.
Yeah, exactly. Or exactly. Or this latest new hot graphic designer. All of which, if people are doing exceptional work or work that seems groundbreaking or different, great. They should that stuff should get the focus. But when there are bigger issues at hand of how cities work or don't, that to me is it's interesting when a kind of design sensibility and vocabulary can be brought to bear fluently about that. I mean, that's the other thing about another secret, dirty truth about when I started doing this in 1986 or 5 or whenever it was, 4 or 5, I guess, was, wow, so much of the writing about this stuff, there's so little good writing.
Right. Yeah,
so I figured I'm a pretty good writer. If I can be one of the relatively rare good writers in this field, I'll do okay.
Yeah.
So that was part of it. I think so that's one of the differences, and one of the improvements is now there are many good writers who sometimes or all the time write about design in a way there simply wasn't 30 years ago.
Right.
Not that any of them are earning enough money to buy lunch doing it, probably, or a few of them. But I think, and not to fall into the jargon hellhole, but the discourse has probably,
this is exactly what this podcast is for, by the way. So you can fall into that
probably
as much as you want.
Improved because people are thinking bigger.
Yeah.
And then just about how this microphone got designed or how this 19th century silver was, whatever it is.
Right. I'm going to kind of change the subject a little bit because you mentioned something in there about writing and how, you're like, oh, I'm a good writer. I could just kind of maybe what you lack in design knowledge or something make up in just good writing. I'm not saying that's exactly what you said.
I understand what you're saying. But what I discovered is that, I had plenty of knowledge and could pretty quickly develop enough knowledge to either fool people and get by, or frankly know as much as the others.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
my feeling like a fraud period, which is lifelong,
All the time,
but in that particular case I didn't feel much after, like, I don't know, a year or so.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, to your point.
What I'm curious about, though, is this kind of jumping around in your career, whether it's subject matter, whether it's even type, going from more journalistic writing to writing novels to plays and television to essentially a history book of the United States, to even a radio show. Does that come from a desire to play with form? Does that come from a getting bored in one thing, wanting to do another thing? Where does that kind of moving between mediums and disciplines come from?
I guess both of those. I mean, I don't, until I have walked this path, which I now have, it's not like I didn't begin thinking, oh, I'd like to play with forms, and I know I get bored easily, and therefore my professional life will be this. Now, and I don't. It's not as though I ever got bored. Because what I ended up, I would say it was more, this opportunity presents itself. This is interesting. Maybe I can do this.
Yeah.
It's adjacent to what I've done before. I've never done it before, but maybe let's try it. So that, I mean, in some unconscious way, it may have been preemptively trying the next thing so that I don't get bored in the last thing. But it wasn't about getting bored. It was really just opportunistic curiosity, if you will. And again, not a self-conscious thing about playing with forms, but this isn't, I had messed around a little bit with fiction when I was very young, but I had not published fiction, until I started writing a novel. And I'd been a professional writer at that point for, a dozen years. 20 years. And so it was, okay, I think I now have, in the case of turning to fiction, like enough, I'm not going to, I mean, yes, I can improve as a writer, but if I'm ever going to be able to write a book, I've got the skills and craft to do so. And I've always wanted to write a novel. And I think I now have enough life experience that it might be interesting enough to transmute into a long work of fiction. So that's how that came about. Radio, just out of the blue, the people in charge of Public Radio International and WNYC came to me and said, hey, we got this show in mind. You want to host it? And I said, are you crazy? And sure. It was, I had a set of skills and I was lucky and the two led me to, do a bunch of different things.
Well, but I mean, let me maybe ask a kind of related question, because what I also think is interesting is that regardless of the form or regardless of the medium or the place where you're doing it, you are still using these kind of different avenues to play with your same interests, just kind of in different ways. And it's like we're talking about, even your novels have design elements, and I think there's some Fantasyland in those.
Right.
Also, does changing that approach or changing that process somehow give you new insight or new ways to look at these things?
I feel like my professional life it has this internal healthy hybridization dynamic that goes on. Absolutely. It all feeds each other. I remember, not early on, but relatively early on in Spy, we did this whole package of stories about postmodernism at the height of postmodernism, and one of its long sidebars was what we called yuppie porn. Before everything was called X porn or Y porn or B porn, and it was the Michael Graves teapot. It was all this stuff, and I loved that then. I've looked back at it since. I still love it. So yes, I was bringing my what I was doing then, still currently writing about this stuff in a Time magazine, somewhat more sober way without ridicule, and bringing it into the Spy magazine context. So that's an example of that crossbreeding as it happens, and it still happens. I wrote a short story, fiction, a few years ago for an anthology, and my radio producer said, "Hey,
Right.
we could turn this into a radio drama for Christmas," and so they did, and we did, and rerun it every couple of years.
Right.
So yeah, it's a delight when that can happen.
Can we talk about Fantasyland a little bit?
Sure.
That was one of those books for me when I read it that kind of completely explained everything that I was trying to figure out in the moment. It was like a perfectly timed book, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But you've been thinking about this for much longer than the era of fake news, much longer than the Donald Trump era. And I have a couple of questions about it, and I want to connect it to design a little bit if we can, because I think it's a book about design in a way too. But before we get to that, when did you start thinking about this, or when did you start kind of noticing this trend or this
thing, this explanation for all that has gone wrong in America, you mean?
Yeah.
It's hard to say. I mean, I remember, as I talk about it, as I mentioned in the book, I remember the first episode of the Colbert Report, and in which Colbert did his truthiness thing, and being, just stunned at the brilliance of that little thing, and how that, for me, was not unlike what you say Fantasyland was for you. Like, wow, this is what's gone wrong, and we were still early, relatively speaking. Then 2005, right? So I know that was a moment. I mean, my first novel was a lot about the merging of news and entertainment and reality and fiction. There's one of the main characters is a journalist turned TV producer who creates this police drama in which real crimes happen. And it came out in 1999, really, before reality TV.
Yeah.
So that, and that, those thoughts about that, 18 years later appear in Fantasyland as well. So was I thinking, someday I'll write a nonfiction book that is my unified theory of America? No. But so I was thinking about pieces of it along the way. And then in the 2010s, I began like, there's probably a book here that I should do. And 2013 I had started writing another novel and said after I finished this to my publisher, like, here's the basic idea for this nonfiction book that I want to write for you. She said, wow, maybe you could do that first. And that's how it came to be. So it was, it was in my head as a possible book for a few years before I started researching and writing, and in all these ways that I didn't know were leading to it for 20 years.
Right. Can you tell? I don't want to get too much into the process of how you wrote and organized the book, but I am curious. I mean, because this is essentially it's your first nonfiction.
First big nonfiction book, yes.
How is that different for you? I mean, it's very journalistic. It has all of Kurt Andersen interests in it, I think, but it's also a very different thing for you.
Yeah, it is.
What was that like? How
well,
did you
for one thing, it was
organizing that.
I mean, it was again, it was never my plan, but thinking, I can write a novel. I think I can maybe write a novel. And then it's terrifying once you start doing it. You have no idea what you're doing. I've never done this before. What was I, crazy? It's like, I was a weekend hiker thinking I can climb Kilimanjaro. And then you do it, and whoa. And then my next novel was an historical novel, which was a whole other thing I didn't know how to do. And similarly, this big nonfiction book, I'd written, 1,000-word pieces, 4,000-word pieces, but like not 174,000 history of America that lots of historians and scholars of various kinds could, think, what does he think he can do this?
Yeah.
So it was terrifying in a new way. I was ill-equipped in a new way. So how did I do it? What I basically do, I mean, this is nonfiction, very, very different than the stuff I amass before I start writing a novel. But in this case, it was just reading and taking notes and having thoughts for, I don't know, just a year and a half before I started writing, and then mushing that into what feels like a more or less proper order, kind of chronological, but within each chronological moment broken into thematic, subjects, and then just start plowing through. And of course, it's not even an outline exactly. It's the stuff I have and the thoughts I've had and the ideas I've had, maybe in the order that they will appear in this book. And some of them go elsewhere and some of them go out the window, and so that's the basic process. And at a certain point, I have had with that, essentially one document that is all my stuff. And then, I start at the beginning, turning this amorphous glop into prose.
Okay. Like I mentioned to you before we started recording, I was in grad school during the 2016 election, and I was just starting to think about this podcast and my thesis project about design criticism, and then the election happened. I had this moment where I was like, design criticism seems like not a really important thing to be thinking about and talking about right now. Like, there are a lot of really big problems in the world. And the more I started thinking about it and the more people I was talking to for the podcast, I started realizing that things like fake news and filter bubbles and all of these things that were kind of in the air could be framed as design problems.
Well, they were all yes, indeed. Yeah. Most of them are the result of choices about how things should be built, how news should be presented, how the internet should be organized or regulated or not regulated. Yes, indeed.
And that to me kind of changed how I then thought about what design criticism could and should be and how this kind of project is. And then that's why Fantasyland was such a kind of revelation to me, that this wasn't necessarily a new problem, but goes back 500 years. And our mutual friend, Jessica Helfand, has this quote that I'm going to mess up a little bit, but something about how design kind of connotes authority, and that when something is well designed or seen as design, that it somehow is given an authority or a truth to it. And I don't know if you kind of talk about design specifically in Fantasyland. There is a line that I really liked early on where you say that this is the first century that was designed. I really liked you using that word there. But could you talk a little bit about how design, how the physical world, the kind of built world media, kind of plays a role in
I think immediately of a couple of places, and they're connected. One is Disneyland and its importance in my history. And I go read the book if you want to find out how I make this argument. But it was one of those things when it opened in 1955 and then 1971 when Disney World came along. But Disneyland, and especially Main Street USA, it was a game changer in introducing, number one, the idea to regular Americans whose old towns were being destroyed and denuded and tossed away. Like, whoa, these old buildings, these fake old buildings, are great. Yeah, we used to live this. Grandpa used to live this way. This was great, and was part of the reason. Part of the softening up the ground for Americans to embrace the redevelopment of downtowns and Rouse, Quincy Market, festival marketplaces and all that stuff, and theming and all so much of the history of urban design and architecture in America, but elsewhere as well. But let's just say America of the last 64 years. Really begins at Main Street USA and Disneyland. So that's one example. And I have it's one of the, there are things that I think are terrible about Fantasyland, and Donald Trump being the embodiment of almost all of them. But I am of two minds about much of it, including the effects of Disneyland fakery and simulacra. Then I also talk a bit later in my chronology in the 1970s as a kind of backward-looking romantic nostalgia about the America that used to be, or
right,
and or never was, and in that context talk about the rise of what was called postmodern architecture and Michael Graves and Bob Stern and all the rest, and oh look. First, it's a joke. It's not really classical architecture, but then it is classical, and then it is just classical revivalism or whatever. But so it's a piece of it there as well, designed very specifically. As is again, Las Vegas has been a recurrent hobby horse of mine, and as I said before, I talk about it, have set big important scenes in my first novel there, but then also talk about it in the context of Fantasyland. And to your point earlier about all my interest appearing in various things I do, I did a cover story after I'd left my design critic job at Time, but occasionally wrote for them about Las Vegas in 1993 and how it was kind of emblematic of a new America and vice versa, and so forth. And the joke I would tell myself is, yes, I try to use all my ideas 10 times and everything, but it's not that. It's not that consciously cynical. It's just that I think Las Vegas is important. I think Disneyland is important.
Yeah.
And it's useful in this context to explain this or to have this episode in fiction happen.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a side tangent, but the Disneyland sections were some of my favorite in the book. A couple years ago, I got really interested in Disney's original plans for Epcot and kind of what he wanted for that. I just found so strange and just kind of weird and utopian, but also with like a bit of a weirdness to it.
Well, like all utopias.
right, exactly. But at the time, I was working in San Francisco at Facebook, and Facebook's campus is designed to have a kind of main street in the middle with these fake shops in the middle where you can like get food and things like that. And visitors would come, and I would overhear people when I'm walking to meetings talk about like, oh, this is just like Disneyland. And I'd have this like weird feeling and just want to be like, Disneyland is fake. Like that's not, I understand it as a compliment, but it's also not a compliment.
Right. Well, and it's to the point though of the blur, the expanding blurry zone that's between fake, obviously fake, and real. And again, part of the problematic parts of Fantasyland are the way that blurring happens in all kinds of ways that we cease being aware of.
Yeah.
And another, again, I keep thinking because of the track you set this conversation on is the using how things I do here pop up there. I mean, there was in my discussion of Disney World and Disney in Fantasyland, there was a whole section actually that came from this set of interviews I spent a day or two doing in Celebration, Florida, for my radio program.
Right. Oh, right. I remember this.
And so that's so even though which is one way of saying, even though my professional life seems disparate to me, it seems of a piece, and because I've been writing about. I initially wrote about Celebration as a design critic at Time Magazine. Then I'd write about Celebration in the context of doing a whole documentary about Disney parks for my radio show. Then I'm writing this History of America about the blurring of fiction and reality. And I use, so it's even though the media change, I only have a certain number of things I'm interested in.
As we all do. Yeah. But I am curious about how. Let me think how to ask this question in not a boring way. How did Donald Trump change the end of Fantasyland? Because you were kind of finishing it while that was happening. Did that change how you thought about the book? Did it change the trajectory of the book at all?
The only way it really changed it was saying to my publishers, like, hey, dudes, this is not just some eccentric history book anymore. I think we may have, now, it may be, it's relevant.
Yeah.
So he started running for president in June of 2015 when I had been writing the book for 9 months.
Okay.
So, but he was still a joke. And so, and then I was in the final stretches of the book in early 2016, when he hadn't even gotten the nomination yet, turned in the finished manuscript before he got the nomination. So he loomed larger in the end, but it was he wouldn't have probably been mentioned in the book had he not run for president.
Right.
If he hadn't won the presidency, I think the difference between the 10 or 12 pages I spent on him out of the 400 in the book, as a result, in the end, wouldn't have been much less had he lost the presidency. So it wasn't. It's not as though I or the book pivoted around to be the story of Trump, 500 years run up. It was just he walked into it kind of. I hesitate to say providentially, but he became this extraordinary poster boy for almost every one of my themes, embodying it as though, wait, what? So that's it's. I hate to say it. I was lucky to have him.
Yeah, and I don't mean to suggest that the book is about Trump.
No, it isn't. But it is. But it's certainly the reason lots of people read it and bought it and all that is because of Donald Trump. No question. I mean, my argument for what has happened to America in this fiction reality blurring and this love of and the kind of American indifference to the difference between fiction and reality would have been true had he not been elected.
Right, exactly.
But the fact that he was elected just made people pay attention and take more seriously this strange theory of American history that I sketched out.
Right. What are you thinking about right now? What are subjects or things that you're giving attention to? I've convinced myself to write another, not a sequel to Fantasyland, but another nonfiction book that I will do faster and will be smaller. And so it's about the future mostly. It's about, instead of the last 500 years, it's about the last 40 years and the next 50, let's say. And so it is much more in the largest sense about design and designing the future, rather than letting it just happen to us, which is, I think we've done a lot in the last several decades. And as though technology and the way it's being deployed and designed is simply just the way it happens. Well, of course it isn't. It's a series of choices made by various people. So that's what I'm thinking about is and it's less. Fantasyland is about the way we think and what we believe. This is more about the politics and economics and kind of the design of our society. That's so interesting.
And again, in terms of, it goes back to this internal hybrid process. It really came out of, even though it doesn't sound like it would have, it came out of the essay you mentioned that I did in Vanity Fair 7 years ago now, about how so much of the physical material culture, in my view, stopped changing 25 years ago to a degree that hadn't happened for more than a century. And why was that? I began groping for explanations. And so that, in terms of what happened 25, 30, 35 years ago in terms of the culture no longer being interested in the new, except for technology being this transformatively new thing. That's a strange, kind of bipolar situation. What's that about? So and so it is about what I'm working on is how to think about the new and how to choose from the various options rather than and it's not all about resisting nostalgia or resisting the past. There's still fine things about the past, but I think a lot of our problem, not all of our problem, but a lot of our problem has been resisting imagining the new or accepting the new, whether they are immigrants, whether it's like, no, we really have to reorganize the way society works in this way or that way, and instead just being mesmerized and paralyzed by the technological new, and like, well, it's what Facebook wants, or that's what Google's doing, or that, and trying to figure out, even though much of the writing about the potential utopia of the 2038 or singularity and otherwise, of when robots give us everything, as naive as or as unthought through as many of those visions of the future are, there's something there to look toward, and so trying to figure out again how to, the future can never be designed; it is not inevitable, but it can be nudged. It can be designed toward, and so that's. I'm not. I mean, whether it's Karl Marx or whomever, or any utopian who thinks, no, this is the future and that's what we need to do. That's ridiculous. But that doesn't mean you just sit back and let it happen to you as a society, as a people. And so figuring out to what degree the future can be designed, and it can be designed more than we as a whole society have allowed ourselves to think it can. The not to sound like a communist, but the forces of the forces of capital for the last 40 years have in large measure and in a very deliberate, successful way designed where we are today. Right. I am not a conspiracy theorist. I am not like they got together in 1973 and said, okay, what do we want to be in 2018? This? Okay, good. No, but there were things done along the way, policy-wise, changing the way people thought, demonizing government, on and on and on, that got us where we are today. So, it seems to me there's an opportunity for people who aren't, gazillionaires to figure out the society that we, the rest of us, want, and say, here's a rendering of that what that could be. Here's a different rendering, and here's a different rendering. Let's move toward one of those.
Right. I love that. Those are all of the things that I love talking about.
Okay.
My last question. This is a question I used to end all of these conversations, and I hope it's not too big of a question. But I'm curious, who are the writers, or what are the books that have kind of influenced how you think about all of this stuff that we've talked about today?
Well, Josh, if you're giving me advance warning, let's see, all this stuff.
Or even if someone's listening to this and is interested in the things you're talking about after they read Fantasyland and your novels, where would you point them?
Well, we can go up and look at the 180 books sitting around my floor upstairs. The problem with that is always, since I'm always working on some book or another, it's that the problem is that book doesn't exist, which is why I'm attempting and will no doubt fail to successfully write it. So there is. I'll tell you one. No, here's one. It's by Walter Lippmann, the journalist, intellectual essayist of the early 20th century, who, as a young man, published a book in 1914 in which, I'm going to get the title wrong, but the word drift appears. Maybe it's the big drift, the drift, something. It's about life. It's about this, what he was seeing as this, we're on this momentous change that had just happened from the old to the new, and we're fitfully trying to understand how that works, and this is here's socialism, but it's wrong in this way, and here it was, and it's not a famous book. I just stumbled across it as I was doing research for this next non-existent book, and it was just mind-boggling of how, wow, this, here we are again 100 years later, and it reminded me of this line that Mark Twain did not say, but is often attributed to him, and I repeated it endlessly. And of course, Fantasyland, which is that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, and it was just amazing. So find the Walter Lippmann book with the word drift in the title, and if you want just a sense of America being confused and terrified and intermittently hopeful 105 years ago.
I love that. Kurt, thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation.
Oh, good.
I'm a big fan.
Good.
This was great. Thanks for being on the podcast.
My total pleasure.
This episode was recorded on December 17th, 2018 in Brooklyn, New York. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.